Thanks. Huh? I know, but you never know who else plugged one in someplace, and these things, you never know how they're wired. The biggest problem is now, thank God, I figure out where the panel was, so I went over and turned it back on. This happened last week. Not in here, someone else's courtroom. So we didn't know where to look.
Jury.
Okay. Okay, jury's present and seated. You may be seated. I apologize for the delay. We had a problem with power here in the courtroom. We have to get that resolved. Mr. Anderson.
Yes, sir.
You may do so. Make sure you speak into the microphone, okay?
Can everybody hear me? Yes. May I proceed, Your Honor?
You may proceed.
Ladies and gentlemen, on November 21st, 2019, the state filed an indictment alleging that Robert Tyrone Hayes, a black male born on March 12th, 1982, committed these 3 Volusia County homicides that occurred in 2005 and 2006. We understand your decisions, and now we're at the second part of this case. As you all remember, during jury selection, I talked about the difference between mitigating factors and aggravating factors. Aggravating factors are the things that the state will present to you to consider in whether or not to impose a death penalty. Mitigating factors, which means lightening or lessening, are the things that I will present to you, and I have presented to you during trial, along with Mr. Shea, that weigh against the imposition of the death penalty. During jury selection, I took time, the prosecutor took time, and Judge Zebrano took time to make sure we got jurors that are capable of considering a sentence of life in prison without parole ever, as well as considering a prison of death, or rather a sentence of death. In addition, time was taken to make sure that you were willing to consider not only the aggravating circumstances that the state will advance in its argument for the death penalty, and as you just heard a moment ago, but you were also able and willing to consider the mitigating circumstances that we, the defense lawyers, present in support of a sentence of life without parole ever. And so it's no coincidence that you are the individuals that we chose. We're now at that point in the case where you're going to have to make those considerations. And they're going to be tough. The first part of the trial was the easy part. You had homicides, you had DNA, and the thing I liked about all of you is that you took your time. I think you were out like 6 hours on the first part of this trial, which says to me that you thought, you considered, you talked, you weighed, and this part of the trial requires even more of that kind of thinking, considering, weighing, discussion. It is actually much more time-consuming. I showed you this before in a big chart that I put up on the bulletin board, and it somehow mysteriously disappeared in the courthouse. But I've got a smaller version, which is just as good, and I'm going to just point at it. You don't really have to read it, but it goes through the steps that you're going to go through. The first step is you will ask yourselves about aggravating factors for the imposition of the death penalty. There are only 2 aggravating circumstances that the state is presenting in support of its pursuit of the death penalty. One, the prior capital offenses, the other murders, and secondly, the state is arguing that the murders were cold, calculated, and premeditated without any pretense of moral justification. Those are specified by statute, and those are the 2 of the several that are allowed the state is pursuing. So with regard to those aggravating factors, the first question you'll ask yourselves is, do they exist? And then, if so, are they considered alone sufficient to justify the imposition of the death penalty? If, in your wisdom and judgment and experience, you decide that they alone are not sufficient to justify the death penalty, that this is a case for life without parole in prison forever, then your process ends, you let the judge know, and your job is done. If not, if you think that there are enough aggravating factors and that they weigh enough to justify considering the death penalty, you go to the next step, mitigating factors. The factors that we present to you and have presented that weigh against the imposition of the death penalty and weigh more towards a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole ever. Then, at that point, you weigh the aggravating factors that the state has advanced against the mitigating factors that we, the defense side of the case, have presented to you. And then, before you reach a final conclusion, you must bear in mind that the law neither compels nor requires that the defendant should be sentenced to death. And so, even if you think the aggravating circumstances outweigh the mitigating circumstances, you're still not required to impose the death penalty. You're still able to have a sentence of life without parole in prison forever. Now, with regard to the 2 aggravating circumstances that the state is advancing, the first one is that of the defendant being previously convicted, Mr. Hayes being previously convicted, of another capital felony. Now, you've already decided that he's committed other felonies, so I'm not going to argue that. We accept your decisions and we're going to move on to the next part of the case. However, I do ask you to consider this. These homicides were quite a few years ago, when the defendant, Mr. Hayes, was a young man, and he's considerably older and more mature now. And in addition, I want you to consider the fact that these were not homicides that were done to maximize the anguish or distress or fear of the victims. Dr. Fulcher testified that all of the victims were killed instantly and lost consciousness instantly, so that we do not have that kind of thing going on. And those are things that you should consider and really give a little less weight if you are convinced of that aggravator. And the other consideration that the state is asking you to consider in support of the death penalty is the one that we briefly refer to as the capital felony, meaning the homicides were committed in a cold, calculated, and premeditated murder without any pretense of moral or legal justification. And, like Mr. Lewis told you, the cold, calculated, and premeditated aggravating circumstances is not just the minimal premeditation required for your conviction of first-degree murder. Okay, it's not just a brief moment of reflection. It's a more deliberate, planned out, more cunning, more thought out intentional murder. Now, you've heard the evidence that Mr. Lewis argued in favor of that, namely the use of a gun, the use of movement and transportation, things like that. But here's the one thing that negates that and eliminates that mitigator completely and indicates that really these killings were committed in some kind of frenzy, not in any cold, calculated way. The defendant, who is a criminology major in college, didn't take the time to use a condom. If these were really cold, calculated, and premeditated, long-term planned out murders, a condom would have been used. No semen would have been left. No DNA would have been left. Ladies and gentlemen, these murders were committed in some sort of mental frenzy. They were not cold, calculated, and premeditated. Now, we are arguing and presenting evidence of 45 separate mitigating circumstances as compared to the 2 state aggravating circumstances that we just got through talking about. And I'm going to go through them and kind of sum up the evidence in each one of them. The first one is that the defendant, Mr. Hayes, has no significant history of prior criminal activity. Admittedly, there's no denying he's here on charges of 3 homicides, but nothing significant before that. Secondly, the capital felony, in other words, these homicides were committed while the defendant, Mr. Hayes, was under the influence of extreme and mental emotional disturbance. There is no question that these homicides were committed under extreme emotional or mental disturbance. An individual who otherwise led a productive life, was well-liked, was friendly, supportive of others. Somehow, something goes haywire. Some triggers are fired off, and he ends up having sex and then, according to the state's arguments, shooting and murdering these 3 young women. What clear evidence could there be of an extreme mental or emotional disturbance? The third mitigating circumstance that we've advanced for you is that the capacity of the defendant, Mr. Hayes, to appreciate the criminality of his conduct or to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law was substantially impaired. And for the same reasons I just gave you on the other mitigating factor, it's clear that there are mental health defects, there's mental illness that absolutely prevented Mr. Hayes from conforming his behavior to the requirements of the law. Another mitigating circumstance that I ask you to consider is the age of Mr. Hayes at the time of the offenses. These offenses were done in 2005 and 2006, and at that time Mr. Hayes was a young man in college in his early 20s. This was not somebody that's seasoned and has more experience in life and has learned how to control his temper and roll with the punches and deal with the emotional stresses that all humans have to endure and we get better at. And I think a lot of folks would agree that we continue to get better at that well into our 50s and 60s and even as old as I am. But I'm serious. It is something you've got to consider, the age. He just doesn't have that kind of experience to develop the good self-control that comes only with time. Another mitigating circumstance Mr. Hayes did not have any father figure residing in the family home. As you heard from his sister Terrace Collins and his own mother, Mr. Hayes' own father was murdered when Mr. Hayes was only a couple years old, resulting in him being raised in a household with no father. Now, a lot of folks will say, I was raised by a single parent. That really doesn't matter. And this is not, none of these things are to excuse anything. They're just factors for you to consider. And the reason that we bring up family hardship and rough childhood things is not as an excuse to murder. There's no excuse to taking the life of another human being. Okay. But there's no doubt that people that are born and live lives of hardship, poverty, without the love and care of a father in their own house, you can't, it's not fair to consider them in the same light you consider somebody that was born with all the advantages and all the comforts. Another mitigating circumstance that we are advancing to you in this case is that his mother, Miss Florence Hayes, always had to work full-time. And this, as you heard, was even when Mr. Hayes was just a tiny little infant and a toddler. Okay, I know a lot of folks have to work full-time, more so now than when I was born in the 1950s and raised in the 60s. But lots of people have a better situation because they have either the mother's able to take some time off work. We now have the Medical Family Leave Act, where if you have a newborn baby, by law, the employers have to let you take some time off with your baby. Many working mothers are able to cut their hours down to part-time or reduced hours so they can spend some time with their child. Many have a live-in family member that'll serve as a nanny and help them out. Miss Florence Hayes had none of that. And so you cannot help but allow for that and consider that in mitigation of the death sentence. Now, you heard that Mr. Hayes was a gifted young child, which resulted in him getting into trouble in school. Well, now we have a different system. Time has passed and we've all advanced where we have special schools and special programs for kids that are way ahead of their classmates. So they don't get the work done that it takes everybody else an hour and 5 minutes and then start, getting bored and getting in trouble. And this factored in Mr. Hayes' life and his upbringing. His mother, Miss Florence Hayes, testified about that. You also heard, and this is another mitigating factor, Mr. Hayes played a musical instrument. Look, any of you that have taken piano lessons or guitar lessons or any musical instrument lesson knows this. You don't go to all that trouble of learning a musical instrument and taking all those lessons for yourself. It's something that you do to entertain and perform for others. It's a giving act. The same with reciting poetry. Maybe some of you had to learn the Declaration of Independence or the Gettysburg Address in school. Memorizing and reciting things is tough. And it's not something you do for your own enjoyment. It's something that you do for the listeners. It's a giving, generous act. You also heard, and this is another mitigating circumstance that we're asking you to consider, that Mr. Hayes was always gainfully employed. He was a hard worker who strived to support his family despite his mental impairments and his inability to hold a job for long. And this was rather remarkable because he had something like 24 jobs over a couple of decades, and you heard how none of them really lasted long. Yet he kept working. He kept going out and trying to work and working all these different jobs in his effort to support his family. the mothers of his 2 children and his 2 daughters. You also heard that Florence Hayes, Mr. Hayes' mother, was a responsible but detached mother. Look, nobody's running down Florence Hayes, all right? She was up against a lot. Her husband was murdered. She had to work full time. Unfortunately, because of her times and her own personality and her own mental issues, she never really was able to do the kind of bonding and the loving coddling that's so important to a young developing mind. You were able to see Miss Hayes on the video screen. And I don't know if you were struck by this or not, but she had this very wooden, unemotional expression on her face. And here I am fighting for her son's life. I just couldn't understand that, but what it did make me understand is what the mental health experts, namely Dr. Hyman Eisenstein and Dr. Graham, were talking about when saying the mother was emotionally detached. Certainly, a child being raised by a mother that doesn't express and doesn't coddle and doesn't show that kind of warmth is going to be affected by it. And we heard a lot from Mr. Hayes' sister, Terrace Collins, on that point. And Terrace Collins had trouble with it. And as she explained to you, the way that Terrace Collins was able to get over that lack of emotional attachment from their mother was over time she learned to forgive the mother. Over time she learned that she was raised in an era when black children had to receive the talk. They were raised in a neighborhood where there was crime. And the approach to dealing with these kinds of things was to be a very firm disciplinarian. To be somewhat distant from your own children for their own protection. Another mitigating factor, this is the 11th that we've advanced for you, is that Mr. Hayes was a loving father to his children. And you've heard about this from his mother, Florence Hayes, his sister, Terrace Collins, his mother's cousin, Denise Williams, and just about every other witness I called. They had a chance to observe how the defendant, Mr. Hayes, talked with his children, interacted with his children, and loved them. I think I might be repeating this one, so I'll skip it and go through it real quick, but he did strive to financially support his children. He didn't live with the mothers of his 2 children. He was not successful at that, and yet he remained in communication with the children he had of those women and maintained it in a productive way. And maybe that's not a big thing, but look at how many men out there, deadbeat dads, just walk off and just put that light behind them and ignore their kids. And that has an effect of damaging the children for life. Mr. Hayes had the decency to maintain that good, loving relationship with his children as best as he could, over the phone, long distance travel, whatever it took. Now, you also heard, and this is our 13th mitigating factor, that he was overweight as a child and bullied. You'll recall that his mother, Miss Florence Hayes, talked about this. I hope that the times have changed. I know they've changed, but for those of us that were raised in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, bullying was allowed. I mean, kids got picked on, and yeah, that's fine. Let them straighten it out. Let them work it out amongst themselves with fist fights in the playground and on the school and way home. We all know better than that now. And science, as we all know, recognizing that bullying is damaging. It's a type of psychological abuse that does tremendous damage to the bullied person. As our 14th mitigating factor, Mr. Hayes cooked for other people. Will give in different ways. You know, not every person wins a Nobel Peace Prize. Not every person wins a Medal of Honor. For most people, the things that distinguish somebody whose life is worth saving as opposed to somebody who should be executed are the little things. Little things matter a lot. And cooking is a great way that even a person that's working, that's not a rich man, can show their love and care for others. And that's how Mr. Hayes did it. He cooked for everyone, friends, family, girlfriends. Even at the church groups, he'd bake for the bake sale. Okay. He wasn't playing any macho man games. He was, let's go bake. Let's do this in the men's group. This is the way Mr. Hayes expressed care and did good things for other folks. Mr. Hayes pursued and earned a college degree in an effort to better himself. Maybe that might seem like an insignificant thing to a lot of us in a day and age when college educations are much more available. But remember, he was raised in really poverty, hard-working circumstances in kind of rough neighborhoods, according to his sister his sister Terrace. And in addition, it takes some perseverance. All you have to do is walk around any part of these coastal cities of Florida and see all these homeless people around right next to a McDonald's with a help wanted sign, and they're holding up signs of begging for food. No, there are folks out there that want to better themselves, that want to earn a college degree, that want to contribute. And Mr. Hayes was that type of person. You didn't hear anybody talking about him panhandling or holding up signs or being a deadbeat. He was trying to make a better future for himself, his family, and his kids. Our 16th mitigating circumstances that Mr. Hayes was raised by a disciplinarian mother who sometimes went too far, and you heard about this from his sister, Terrace Collins. You heard about this from Denise Williams. And there was a point at which a disciplinarian whooping, as the colloquial expression goes too far and it becomes a beating. And it crosses the line into abuse. Now, I think all of us that are parents know that there's times when you have to get kids' attention and you have to do maybe even physical discipline so that they don't run after their ball and out in the street and get run over by a car. That's part of parenting, that's part of being a child. But when a spanking escalates to a beating and it's happening with regularity and it's hard and it's done with a razor strap, the things that you heard Terrace Collins say went on in that household, it's not intentional, but it was abuse. And it damaged Mr. Hayes. And you heard Dr. Nicole Graham, Dr. Hyman Eisenstein, and Joseph Wu all testify that that type of physical and emotional distress damages young minds. And that damage continues into adulthood. You also heard from Mr. Hayes' sister, Terrace Collins, that he was molested by a family member. And as before, Doctors Nicole Graham, Dr. Hyman Eisenstein, and Joseph Wu all testified that that is exactly the type of childhood traumatic experience that damages young, developing minds, and that the damage continues into adulthood. For our 18th mitigating circumstance, we submit to you that Mr. Hayes was a loving son to his mother, despite everything. He stayed on the phone with her, he communicated with her, he showed up at family events. And this information came from his sister Terrace Collins, but also his friends, Clifton Williams, Jason Caldwell. It was real enough that at least 3 people remembered it, to the point that they were able to still talk about it today during this trial that we've had. You've also, and this is our 19th mitigating circumstances, you've heard information that Mr. Hayes was an involved and active member of his extended family. You've heard from Terrace Collins on that, and you've heard from Denise Williams on that. He was present and active at family cookouts and get-togethers. And in addition, he was there for other family members going through tough times. You also heard testimony that when somebody suffered a death or a loss of a loved one, that Mr. Hayes would be the first one to call to console them and try to help them feel a little better, get past it. You've also heard, and this is, I think, our 19th or 20th mitigating circumstances, that Mr. Hayes was he maintained loving relationships with his siblings and his other family members, despite everything that went on in the challenging household that Mr. Hayes was raised in. Circumstances that typically pit siblings against each other and bring out the worst child rivalry situations. Not in Mr. Hayes' case. He actually maintained loving, long-lasting, caring relationships with his sisters and his other family members. Our next mitigating circumstances, Mr. Hayes behaved appropriately around children and women and others. You heard this from Denise Williams, his friend Natisha Cornelius, the truck driver, and some of his other friends in the North Carolina area. You've also heard, and this is yet another mitigating circumstance, that Mr. Hayes was a peaceful, nonviolent person. You heard this from Clifton Williams and Jason Caldwell. Now, I know somebody wants to say, stop right there, Mr. Henderson. We've just convicted him of killing 3 people. And I'll get to that later on. But when he was not in the very limited circumstances that triggered his emotional frenzy, when he was not in that limited circumstance, and we'll go into that a little further. It's a very narrow, limited circumstance. He was peaceful and nonviolent. You heard that from Clifton Williams and Jason Caldwell. In fact, when a situation would escalate, when he'd see somebody start to argue or maybe a fight or a quarrel about to break out, Mr. Hayes was the peacemaker that would stop it and calm everything down. Even when he was in an emotional quarrel with Miss Shoney, the mother of one of his children, one of his 2 daughters. I'm at our 22nd mitigating circumstance. Mr. Hayes was a good listener who was there for others. You heard about this from his sister Terrace Collins, his mother cousin, Miss Denise Williams. You heard this from Harold Price, and you heard this from Jason Caldwell. In fact, you may recall that Denise Williams testified that Robert was there to reach out and comfort her own son, Harold, when Harold lost his wife. Nobody else did that. For number 23, I have the mitigating circumstance of Mr. Hayes being raised in a rough, gang-infested neighborhood. I may have covered that already, but just to remind everybody, his sister Terrace Collins mentioned that. The crime, the dangers to children, the way that the mother had to have the talk with the children and had to be the firm disciplinarian to protect them from all the risks and dangers that were outdoors. Now, you've also heard, and this is yet another mitigating circumstance, and let me stop myself right here. There are two kinds of mitigating circumstances. There are what we call positive mitigation, which are good qualities, virtues, kind act, okay? Those are things that you should consider in deciding whether somebody should go to prison forever without parole versus having them executed, okay? Those are positive, good qualities. But another factor, what we call negative mitigation, which means hardships, setbacks, handicaps, okay? Those are another reason to consider in your decision to perhaps not sentence Mr. Hayes to the death penalty. And this is the next one, mitigating circumstance number 24, that we're advancing to you, is that Mr. Hayes resorted to prostitutes for sex. And we heard Mr. Clifton Williams go into detail about that. It's clear that Mr. Hayes had a problem when it came to having relationships, basically romantic, intimate relationships with women. He was unable to maintain any long-term relationship. He was no longer with the mothers of his two children, even though he was a good dad. But there was a problem there. And because sex is something that's not out in the open, it's not something that we can see and point out, I suppose, unless you go on the internet. And so Mr. Hayes had to resort, or chose to resort, to prostitutes for sex. That's a dangerous thing, you know? A person can pick up a disease, they can get mugged. And Clifton Williams also talked about, in the same regard, he had this really abnormal sex drive. Abnormal to the point where not only was he utilizing prostitutes for sex, and think about this, he's not a bad-looking man. He presents himself well, he's attractive. But clearly, the women out there are perceiving something's wrong, and he's having to resort to prostitutes for sex. And his sex drive is so strong, in fact, that he's going to sex clubs, he's using Backpage, looking for sex for money. He's talking to Clifton Williams and asking him, you ought to go to one of these sex parties with me. And that kind of obsession and that kind of preoccupation with sex is an impediment to normal life. I'm not talking about a normal, healthy male sex drive. I'm talking about this extreme level of obsession and this strong pursuit of it to the point of endangering oneself with getting AIDS, to the point of paying, and the point of going to these social parties and situations that are just flat out dangerous and clearly abnormal. And I've got here written down recited poetry, and that's kind of like playing a musical instrument. I mentioned that before. Clifton Williams talked about that, how he'd go down to these performances and recite poetry. Again, something that takes memorization, effort, and is done for the listener. It's not done for the talker, the person that does the poetry recitation. You've heard testimony that Mr. Hayes, and this is our 26th mitigating circumstance, treated the mothers of his children appropriately. You heard this from Clifton Williams and from Miss Connie Sifford. Even though he could not maintain any kind of marital or long-term partner relationships with the mothers of his two children, he managed to maintain a civil and good phone relationship. He was able to continue visiting his two daughters. He somehow managed to have a phone relationship with the mothers of his two children, which is extraordinary, given that he has all these psychological problems that prevent a normal partnership or husband-wife type relationship. 27th mitigating circumstance is that he was able to control his temper. Clearly, outside the very limited circumstance where he would fly off the handle and go into a frenzy in sexual situations with women, outside of that very limited circumstance, he could control his temper. You heard Clifton Williams talk about how one time he saw Shoney and Mr. Hayes get into a big heated quarrel, and Clifton Williams was clearly worried this was going to escalate and explode and get ugly. But no, Mr. Hayes took a deep breath, calmed himself down, and got through the situation. Not only that, you heard other witnesses testify that Mr. Hayes helped them control themselves and helped them better learn to manage their own lives and stay out of trouble. And that's certainly a quality that will be of benefit in a prison situation. My 28th mitigating circumstance is that Mr. Hayes is a large, imposing man which tends to intimidate people. You know, in a society that celebrates big people, football players, athletes, you know, it's easy to say, boy, it's great to be big. But in fact, it's tough. It's tougher on big people. They have trouble buying clothes. They walk into a room and people automatically assume, oh my God, here's this big guy. He's going to hurt me. I better be careful. This could be dangerous. It's naturally intimidated by a big person. And yet you heard testimony that was all appearance. He was a teddy bear. He really wasn't big and intimidating at all. So that Mr. Hayes, in his interpersonal relationships, in his interfacing with other people, had to deal with this. Our 28th mitigating circumstance, Mr. Hayes was helpful. You heard about Jason Caldwell talking about how Mr. Hayes was there when you needed a hand on something, always there to assist. Our 29th mitigating circumstance, Mr. Hayes was reverent. You heard from Jason Caldwell, Connie Sifford, and Natisha Cornelius that he was reverent. He went to church. He participated in church. You heard that he was the person that would urge other people to go to church when they were disinclined to do so. He was active in the men's church group, even cooked for the church bake sales. Mr. Hayes was a reverent person. Our next mitigating circumstance, Mr. Hayes is loyal. What you heard from all of the witnesses, family and friends, were that Mr. Hayes was not a fair weather friend. He was there through thick and thin. He was loyal. He stayed with people. Just think for a moment how little loyalty there is left in the world today. That's a very significant thing. Mr. Hayes was friendly. This is our 30th mitigating circumstance. You heard this from Jason Caldwell, Connie Sifford, Natisha Cornelius. And remember the testimony about how he helped the other young college students at Bethune-Cookman College learn the ropes. The newcomers that came to college, they were homesick, they didn't know quite how to act. And who was the first person that was helpful and friendly and helped them learn the ropes and how to transition from home life to college life? Mr. Hayes. You also heard that Mr. Hayes likes to make other people happy, likes to get other people laughing. He has a sense of humor. You heard this from Connie Sifford, Natisha Cornelius. You heard about how he even was a cheerleader. He helped rouse school spirit. And we have a picture on that. May I have a photograph of the school cheerleading team? you'll be able to take us back in the jury room with the other exhibits, but here's a photograph of Mr. Hayes on the Bethune-Cookman cheerleading team. There he is, raising the school spirit and getting everybody happy. So this is a mitigating factor, wanting people to be happy. This is something that's not all about me. This is not something that is selfish. This is something about other folks, making them feel good. That's a mitigation matter that's worthy of some serious consideration by you. You also heard that, and this is our 32nd mitigating circumstance, that Mr. Hayes treated all others with respect, not just women, not just children, not just family members, but everybody treated them appropriately and respectfully. You heard that from Connie Sifford and Natisha Cornelius. Our 33rd mitigating circumstance is that Mr. Hayes is brave. You heard Connie Sifford talk about how a stranger was banging on the door trying to get in her house, beating on the door. And Mr. Hayes was just a guest. He could have left, but he would not leave until that problem had ended, until that stranger had gone away, and he was absolutely certain that Connie Sifford was safe. Our 34th mitigating circumstance, mental illness. You heard Dr. Graham, Dr. Eisenstein, and Dr. Wu all agree that Mr. Hayes has executive functioning deficits. All agree on this. And Dr. Graham explained this probably in more simple terms than anybody. The executive functioning part of the brain is the part that's like the chief executive officer of a corporation. It's the part that keeps all the other parts moving and working correctly. It's the part that enables people to behave appropriately, control their impulses, form and maintain relationships, and that part of the brain is not functioning correctly. There's deficits in it. Now, there are some areas in the psychiatric testing where Mr. Hayes does very well. He does very well in normal IQ intelligence matters, but then you'll recall the charts had a certain part where there were these strange alternating strengths and weaknesses, these gaps. And they didn't quite understand it. And then what they were able to discern before they went to Dr. Wu was he has these executive functioning deficits which impair his ability to control himself and his ability to form long-term relationships, his ability to control his impulses. And I'll get to more on that in a moment. But our next mitigating circumstance is that Mr. Hayes, this is number 34B, he's a relatively young man. He was only 23 years old at the times of these murders. And as I said a moment ago, this is not an excuse, all right? There's no excuse for murder, but this is something to consider in mitigation. A 23-year-old man does not have the self-control experience that a person in their 40s or 50s or older has. That's something you should consider in mitigation. You've also heard about a history of head trauma. Now, I know there's been some scoffing at this, but without a doubt, the person that seemed to understand this the best was Dr. Hyman Eisenstein. He talked about when Mr. Hayes was beaten in the head as a child, he suffered from some sports injuries. Dr. Eisenstein said there was even at one point a head trauma that was significant enough for him to be hospitalized and given a brain scan that was inconclusive. And of course, as you heard, the other mental health experts testified that that type of head trauma can lead to brain damage, which is a severe mental impairment in and of itself. The 36th mitigating factor is a history of drowning and suffering oxygen deprivation to the brain. Again, that was another matter that Dr. Eisenstein testified to. as Dr. Eisenstein explained, Mr. Hayes was just a kid, and he apparently couldn't resist the temptation, stole some sneakers and got chased, ran into a retention pond, and nearly drowned. He suffered oxygen deprivation to the brain to the point that he had to be hospitalized, and again, thoroughly checked out, including a brain examination, which the doctor subsequently can now look back on and say that looks like it factored and contributed to the brain damage in addition to the head trauma. Now, you've heard from Dr. Joseph Wu that Mr. Hayes has an autism spectrum disorder. And bear this in mind. Dr. Wu is a medical doctor, an MD. He runs a neuroimaging center at the University of California, Irvine. He has also run a neuroimaging clinic at the University of California, Irvine. And what his specialty is neurocognitive imaging, okay? This is something that is more advanced than any of the other doctors you heard from. In fact, I think it should be pretty clear to you that some of the other radiologists, the x-ray readers that were called by the states, just didn't understand it. Okay. It is cutting-edge technology, and it reveals things that are not revealed by other things. And Dr. Wu explained what folks with the autism spectrum disorder, some of their traits. They compartmentalize things. They tend to repeat things. They have ability maintaining relationships. And think about it, the pieces fit. Mr. Hayes couldn't maintain relationships with the mothers of his children. Mr. Hayes couldn't hang on to a job for any length of time. Despite anything and everything he did, his best efforts, he just couldn't keep those things together. Repeated behaviors. And sometimes you just have to face the facts. What more clear example of repeated behaviors can there be than these 3 murders? They're all strangely repetitive. All the victims were found naked, face down, gunshots in low visibility areas. It's just too similar to be just coincidence. It's got an autistic repetition, an autistic sameness about it. And yet you heard that autistic folks aren't necessarily like the character Tom Cruise played in the movie Rain Man, where it's really obvious this person has severe autism. No. People with autism, spectrum disorder, can be very productive and accomplished people, like actress Daryl Hannah, actor Dan Aykroyd, the comedian, Bill Gates. I'm just repeating what Dr. Wu said. And so it is quite possible to be very smart in some areas and yet have a severe problem in one other small area of one's life because of the autistic spectrum disorder. I want to talk for a moment about the state's expert, Dr. Jeffrey Nagin, the car crash x-ray guy, the radiologist. He scoffed and said that this DTI technology is not accepted. But did you listen closely? He said, yeah, but it is being used in some hospitals. Okay, that's double talk, folks. In fact, as Dr. Wu testified, and he had to clarify, we had to bring him back in here, not only is DTI, the brain scanning technology, accepted, but it is embraced and advanced and supported by many legal scholars, many medical scholars. It is accepted. It is regularly being used in hospitals. including Walter Reed, for returning veterans that are suffering from improvised explosive device brain problems. And so I would submit to you that Dr. Jeffrey Nagin is somebody to be very dubious about. He said he testified 75% of the time for the defense, you know, and I smelled a rat. And I asked him, your work's being done for insurance companies, right? And did you see how he danced around that? All he had to say was yes. And my 75% of the work for the defense is for insurance companies. They hire me to try to disprove brain damage. He could have said that, or they try to hire me to disprove a broken leg or a broken arm in a car crash. Instead, I had to go round and round and round, and then finally he admitted, yeah, I do car crash work. I diagnose broken legs, broken thoracic spines, and up to the head. One-stop shopping. Folks, you don't want to listen to a car crash guy in a case like this that involves serious brain problems. You need to listen to the experts. You know, I thought of an analog for this, and it's like this. The state raises the question, well, how come Hyman Eisenstein and Dr. Nicole Graham didn't diagnose this autism spectral condition? Well, what happened was Dr. Hyman Eisenstein sensed that there's something else going on and said, you need to go to Dr. Wu. There's something happening here I don't quite grasp. I got a bad feeling about this. We need to call in this expert, Dr. Wu, who was with the University of California in Irvine and who ran the clinic and has all this experience. We need to find out what he says. There's something else going on here. And that's when Dr. Wu ran the brain scan, looked at the pattern, and said, oh my goodness, this is exactly what we see in folks with autism, with the autistic spectral disorder. And then it all made sense. The pieces started falling together. And far from being somebody that fabricated a diagnosis, this builds, Dr. Wu's work built upon the work of Drs. Nicole Graham and Dr. Hyman Eisenstein. It's kind of like this. Imagine you're going to buy a house, and you look at it, and you look at the wall, and you see something uneven. You go, yeah, there could be a problem here. I don't like that unevenness. Let me call a carpenter to give me an opinion on it. And the carpenter goes over and looks at it and says, you know what, there's some beams here. I'm a little bit concerned. I don't really see anything. I can't point to any one thing structurally wrong with it, but I think you need to get an entomologist, a termite inspection, to look at this. There may be a problem there. The termite inspector comes out and looks at it and says, no termites, but I think something else is going on here. You need to call a structural engineer. And you get the structural engineer to look at the house, and the structural engineer says, I don't care how beautiful this house is, do not touch this. The reason that wall is uneven is because the foundation is cracked and sinking. It'll cost you more than this house is worth to fix it. Run, don't walk to get away from this. Well, that's the same kind of thing that happened here. We had some experts come in, and they looked, and they made their own determinations. They did find some things, but they had this concern that there's something more out there. And so Dr. Wu was called in, and indeed he found this. And the technology is legitimate. Dr. Wu is not just an x-ray machine operator. He's not just a radiologist. He is a neurocognitive imaging expert. And that neurocognitive imaging is accepted by hospital, is accepted by scholars, and it's accepted by the VA hospital to help veterans deal with improvised explosive devices head trauma. You can believe that there is indeed spectrum autistic disorder. Sometimes a version is called Asperger's. If Dr. Wu sees it, it's there.
Counsel, it's been about an hour.
I'll try. Yes, I'm coming to the end. All right. Now, another mitigating circumstance is that Mr. Hayes was generous. He gave to others at bake sales. He donated blood regularly, a lot of blood. He clearly wanted to do good, and that's how he did it. I'm going to sum up some of the other high points on this. I've got a list by some of the people, not all of them, and I'll just go over them. Jason Caldwell was Mr. Hayes' best from college. He talked about how he loves Robert, considers him a best friend. They communicate regularly. Robert is supportive. Robert always asks Jason about his own life and career. Robert even calls annually to wish him happy birthday. Robert and Jason talk about their fathers. And Jason is the person who, during the freshman year at Bethune-Cookman College, Robert went out of his way to befriend him when he was homesick and unfamiliar with college life. Robert ended up becoming like a brother to Jason. Robert even went home with Jason during Thanksgiving and during the college years and became like a family member. And in fact, after college, Robert lived with Jason in North Carolina, attended his church, participated in his family man, and indeed was a God-fearing church member. Robert's older daughter, and this is another father-daughter point, spent summers there in North Carolina with Robert and Jason's family, and that enabled Jason to see just how good a father Robert is and how his little girl was his world. Connie Sifford, Jason's mother, also testified that she was grateful that Robert was there to help her son Jason when Jason was away from school at Bethune-Cookman College. Connie Sifford loves Robert just like one of her own sons. She considers himself a second mother to Robert. Robert fit in the family at Thanksgiving gatherings, became involved in Connie Sifford's church events, was respectful. Robert even became part of Connie's extended church family, and not only joined the men's ministry and cooked, but Robert won first place for his cheesecake, and Connie Sifford, like her son Jason, agreed that Robert is a great father to his little girl. Then we have Natisha Cornelius, the truck driver that we saw from college, and explained in no uncertain terms that Robert's a good friend from college, has a great sense of humor, likes to make people laugh, even to the point of being somewhat of a clown. And she's going to continue her friendship with Robert while Robert's in prison. I'm going to skim through some of these because some of them are repetitive. Terrace Collins, Robert's sister, in addition to testifying to the sad things, the physical abuse and the molestation, said that Robert was the only family member who reached out to support her in December when her own son was killed in a car accident. Terrace Collins testified that a death sentence for Robert would be very traumatic for her and the whole family. That's how much of an important consideration and part of the family's life Mr. Hayes is. Even Florence, Mr. Hayes' mom, who was a strict disciplinarian, still clearly indicated she loves her son Robert and will continue to maintain a relationship with him in prison, and that his death would hurt her. Folks, life in prison without parole is forever. You're not going to hear any jury instruction that says they're going to get out or get pardoned or anything like that. If you sentence Mr. Hayes to life in prison forever, you will be sparing his life. But you're also assuring that he will be locked up and spend his last moment in prison. His freedom will be taken from him. Every minute of every day will be controlled and decided by others. It's a tough life. And when I selected jurors along with the state, I asked you, does anybody think that life in prison is easy? And everybody said no. And I don't think I have to repeat that point. You know, Mr. Hayes can do things in prison if his life is spared. He can be a positive influence on the younger inmates. He can cook and serve others in prison. Look, all life is important. All life is valuable, including the 3 lives that were taken in these homicides. It would be hypocrisy for me to beg for Mr. Hayes' life and then somehow say something that would unintentionally be taken as me saying that victims' lives don't matter. They do matter. It's tragic. And all I can say is all lives matter, and the point now for you to decide is whether Mr. Hayes gets executed or goes to prison without parole forever. And in making that decision, I asked you to consider the things that I've just said. And the whole bottom line of what this is, Mr. Hayes is good in almost every circumstance except when a narrow set of triggering events trigger his autistic spectral disorder and these horrible crimes occurred. And what were those triggering events? According to Dr. Wu, he caught it on the timeline. It's when he has stress and trouble with women and when his heart's broken. He can't deal with it. That sends him off the deep end, and that's how these murders occurred. That's how they occurred so systematically and so uncannily, identically, and that's how they were set up. And yet the fact that they were not cold, calculated, premeditated, that they were the product of a damaged mind is evident in that everything was done, a gun, a vehicle, setting up the contacts, and no use of a condom by somebody that knows from their criminology classes that that's going to leave their DNA all over the place. That's the narrow set of triggering events and circumstances, and those circumstances don't exist in prison. Okay. There's going to be no back page. There's going to be no hookup websites. There's going to be no dating women in prison. All right. So Mr. Hayes is not all bad. There's a good side to him, a good side that I hope I persuaded you makes him one that should go to prison for life without parole ever, rather than be executed. And your decision today will be final. You will decide whether he lives or dies. You will be sentencing him here today. It's a tough decision. And when you're driving home late at night down the I-95 or down Speedway or Granada or any major road, you're going to be thinking back on this day. You're going to be thinking back on this decision for the rest of your lives. And you want to have confidence that you did the right thing, that you didn't skip any steps. Have you noticed that there are no meek people, no shrinking violets among you? Nobody's cowering. Everybody is energetic and involved. There's a reason for that, because we needed jurors that matter. Every single one of you mattered. We don't just need one king deciding this case. Each one of you brings different experiences, different perspectives, different views in deciding between life or death, and every single one of your views matter. And I ask you during jury selection to respect each other's view and not to bully people or intimidate them. Now, you're all to try to reach a verdict. The judge will instruct you. You're to go back and try to reach a unanimous verdict. And you need to follow the judge's instruction. However, if you're convinced that life is an appropriate sentence, rather than executing Mr. Hayes, and you firmly believe it, don't be intimidated. Be that one bright light in the sea of darkness that says no. He's going to prison for life, forever without parole. That's what our jury system is all about. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Can you hand out the jury instructions? I apologize. Your lunch has arrived, and it's gonna be a little bit cold. Try to time this, and I timed it wrong. I need that. Huh? He does. Here, Bill, they need copies. All right, I'm going to start reading on page 2. Members of the jury, you have heard all the evidence and the argument of counsel. It is now your duty to make a decision as to the appropriate sentence that should be imposed upon the defendant for the